Now, as the 2019 president last year, I had one of the highlights of my tenure of that entire year was elevating Dr. Henry Samueli to the status of HKN Eminent member. Eminent member is not something that you apply for. It is something that people in your field and people that respect you nominate you for. So the other highlight was actually getting to meet Henry. And as you've probably read already, Henry is the chairman of Broadcom Inc. He's the owner of the Anaheim Ducks, chairman of the Broadcom Foundation Board, and sits on the Samueli Foundation Board. He's the winner of a Marconi Society Prize and Fellowship. Most importantly, Henry is a gentleman, a scholar, and a mentor, so he's a true HKN person, and has a passionate supporter of engineering education and the students who choose to pursue this path. He epitomizes scholarship, character, and attitude, and I am beyond honored to introduce you to him.
Well, thank you, Karen. I really appreciate that, and very nice words, Olivia, as well. Thank you. Obviously, we're going through some pretty challenging times, and none of us ever expected we'd be doing virtual graduations. But I think, when I think about it a little more deeply, it wasn't that long ago that this was not even possible. Less than 20 years ago, we could not do a virtual graduation because the global broadband infrastructure that we're leveraging right now to do these video conferencing calls did not exist. In fact, that was the entire reason Broadcom was founded, was to help enable this broadband communications infrastructure to enable us to go from traditional voice-only services to interactive video. So I think even though it's challenging for what we're going through, we actually are blessed in one sense that we are still able to interact, albeit in a virtual way, but it is a viable means of interaction that has very recently been enabled by electrical and computer engineers like yourself. So I want to congratulate you on your accomplishments. And I thought what we would do, rather than me sit here and talk for 15 minutes, and it's difficult to, you could be watching a YouTube video. We thought it might be better to make it a little more interactive. So what I asked Karen to do was go out and solicit questions from several of you HKN members, and hopefully we could then generate some timely discussions based on what's going on in the world around us, rather than a more traditional speech. So she went out and did that, collected several questions. So we'll make this more of an interactive session to hopefully keep your attention a little bit better. So Karen, why don't you go and start asking some of the questions that you solicited from the students.
Sure. So thank you to everybody who submitted your questions. The first one, Henry, is how can electrical and computer engineers help society be better prepared for future pandemics or similar situations? And the second part of that question is how can technology be used to solve the current issues that have risen due to the coronavirus pandemic? So I guess the first one is how do we better prepare? I was hoping this would never happen again, but obviously we should be prepared. So how do we do that?
Yes. No, that's the key. I think the key to any major disaster like this is preparedness. And I think that's sort of what caught us off guard here with this pandemic is we didn't quite believe it in the beginning. And there may have been a lot of false information going around, so who knows who's to blame for that. But it took us a while to react. And unfortunately, when you're dealing with exponential problems, as engineers are very well aware, they can get out of control very quickly. It's 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks can make an enormous difference in the spread of a disease when things are happening exponentially. So engineers definitely can help being better prepared in the future. It's not like you can stop pandemics from occurring. They've occurred forever. You can go back in history and read all about them. So we're not going to stop them from occurring. But by being more prepared, we can definitely make a difference. So what can engineers do? Well, the key issues for being prepared for a pandemic, as you've heard over the last few months, number one is early detection. Those that found out quickly and acted quickly had the minimum amount of impact. And there are several examples out there. I think from my personal experience, because as Broadcom, we have a global supply chain that we have to deal with to get our products built. They may be designed largely in the US, but they're largely manufactured in Asia. So Taiwan is a great example of a country that has very minimal impact due to COVID, because they acted quickly and did the right thing. So they didn't have to shut down. Most of their companies kept working in a little different way, but they were still effective, productive. And so what are the areas that they were good at? Early detection, number one, as I mentioned. Second, contact tracing, being able to quickly identify who's infected and who have they interacted with in the last few weeks. And that's where engineers, especially electrical and computer engineers, can have a huge impact in the future. I wouldn't be surprised if, and it probably would require government mandates potentially, because it may have an impact on privacy, but it is relatively easy to technically implement contact tracing software. Every one of us has smartphones. Every one of us has GPS on their smartphones. So in theory, where you are at all times is known inside that device. Now, if you're willing, or if the government mandates that data become available, and hopefully in a very protected way, you could easily create the algorithms in Google Maps or Apple Maps that trace where you are and trace where everybody else is, and then know when somebody gets within 6 feet of you within the last 2 weeks, and instantly identify who they are. It's actually fairly simple. It doesn't require sophisticated machine learning algorithms to do this. This is probably a freshman computer science program that you could write to find out who you've been in touch with for the last 2 weeks automatically. And that has a huge difference, because once you know that you're infected and you can identify who you were in touch with in the last few weeks, you can go and quarantine them, contact them, quarantine them, and shut down the spread of this exponential problem very quickly. And then the other area that's critically important is effectively implementing social distancing, and ideally doing it in a way that doesn't shut down economies, which we've experienced here in a very serious way. But again, looking to an example like Taiwan, they have implemented social distancing very effectively without shutting down their economy. So I think this may not be an electrical and computer engineering problem, but it's probably an engineering, maybe an industrial engineering problem of how do you design work environments where you can quickly adapt and switch from traditional, highly social interacting environments to more social distancing environments without shutting them down. And I think it's very doable, and building workplaces that are easily adaptable to this could be something for industrial engineers to solve. So the engineers will play a major role going forward. And of course, scientists working on the medical side, bioengineers, whatever, working on treatments, vaccines, whatever, that's a whole different area. So there's no question that the STEM professionals will help us be better prepared for these pandemics as they arise in the future. Hopefully not for many decades or centuries to come, but they will happen again.
Thank you, Henry. You mentioned about how we have to change things due to the social distancing and things like that. So the next question is really about that. If it's difficult in the best of times to be a very sociable as an engineer, how do you recommend students entering the workforce to establish personal relationships during a time of social distancing and increasing telework?
Well, I think engineers are very lucky in many respects. First of all, many of them don't even know that there's a pandemic going on, because we've just told them to go home, sit in front of a computer and work. And they say, okay, so what else is new? Engineers are largely antisocial. I can include myself in that group. But because of that, because engineers largely do their work in front of computers, the impact to the engineering profession has been much less severe than other professions. Unfortunately, there are many other professions out there that rely on social interaction, and they have been devastated. So as far as engineers go, I wouldn't worry so much about the fact that you're somewhat isolated from your colleagues and you're not in a work environment that you can socially interact. You can still be productive at home And Broadcom certainly has been very productive even throughout this entire pandemic with our engineers at home. So, yeah, you live through the problems of not interacting, but it will come to an end. There will eventually be a vaccine. There will eventually be therapeutics that people will take. This will die off and things will return to normal. And you can then re-enter the workforce without an issue and start interacting with your colleagues. But for now, don't feel sorry for yourselves because you are probably the least effective profession of all, and you should count your blessings.
That's awesome. Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned, we don't even realize there's a pandemic if you're working from home. So that's the next question is COVID-19 has all got us thinking about time management now. So how are you able to juggle in and fit in all your interests? You got work, you got, philanthropic endeavors, you got your sports. What's going on? How do you do it?
Yes. Well, time management is a very, very important skill. And it is a skill. I don't think it's something that naturally, although I think there are some genetic components to it because some people tend to be better at time management than others. Like me, for example, I like to be exactly on time to every meeting. I know people who love to get to meetings 10, 15 minutes early just to be safe. I know some people who come late to every meeting they're invited to. So there probably is some genetic component. I like to arrive on time, not 5 minutes early, not 5 minutes late. I think it's the most efficient, so it works. But time management, what do you do with your time every day? I think that is so critical. And in the early parts of your career, it probably is less critical because typically in the early parts of your career, your job is much more focused on one specific task. Your manager tells you, work on this, and that's all you have to do. So there's just a matter of executing on that one thing, and you're not distracted with other things. But as you move on in your career and you move into management, not everybody does. Some people stay technical for their whole career, and that's great. But those that move into management, you start broadening your horizons. You start having multiple projects you have to oversee. You have multiple employees you're overseeing. So you have to figure out how to allocate your time to projects because there's a much higher demand for your time than actual hours in the day. And the only way you can do that is by prioritizing things and deciding what's the most important thing for you to be doing today and spending your time on, and you work your way down the list, and eventually you run out of time and the things below the line don't get done that day. And that's certainly something I do literally every day of my life is time manage my way through my priority list to see what's most important and what's least important and what will just not get done. So it's a skill, and it's something you should consciously work on, where you think about, okay, what am I going to be doing today? What am I going to be doing this week, this month? What are the tasks that are most important to me? How do I prioritize things and therefore decide what to spend time on and what to deprioritize and not spend time on?
Awesome. That's great advice. Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna use some of that because my list is never seems to die, and it doesn't go away. So that's something that we all need throughout our lives. So the next question is about your entrepreneurship. Did you always know you wanted to start your own company? And if not, at what point in your career did you just decide to just do it? And what motivated you to take the plunge?
No, that's a great question because as it turns out, I had never had plans to be an entrepreneur. It was very opportunistic, almost kind of just happened to fall in my lap. When I went to school, I just was very focused on electrical engineering. In fact, I got stimulated to be in electrical engineering going all the way back into 7th grade, where I built a Heathkit radio project as a 7th grade electric shop class project. And I was so fascinated by it. This hands-on learning to me is so important for kids. I was so fascinated by it. I said, I've got to figure out how this worked. And I devoted my life to understanding how this thing worked. I built this radio, plugged it in, and sound came out of it. I had no clue what was happening, but my curiosity drove me to an entire career of electrical engineering just so I could figure out how that worked. So, but when I went to school, I did my bachelor's, master's, PhD right after one another at UCLA. Then came time to go to work. and I went to work in the defense industry in Southern California. I went to UCLA, lived in LA, and companies like TRW, Hughes, Rockwell, Northrop, the big large defense contractors, were the largest employers in those days in 1980 when I graduated with my PhD. So it was natural most PhDs or graduate students ended up working at these large defense contractors on various problems. So I picked TRW as the one I wanted to work for. They were a military communications contractor. They built satellites and radio communication systems for military applications. And I loved it because I was working on some incredibly challenging problems, very sophisticated, complex things. And it was so stimulating. And I thought I could do that forever. I'd spend my whole career there. But 5 years into that, UCLA came around and asked me to become a professor. They started actually a couple of years even before that. They asked me to teach some classes part-time, which I did for them. And I enjoyed it so much, and my student evaluations were so great that they said, wait a minute, maybe we should just bring them on full-time as a professor. So they offered me a full-time tenure-track faculty position in 1985. And it was too good to turn down. I mean, being a university professor at a major university like UCLA was an opportunity I couldn't turn down. So again, opportunistically, it fell in my lap. I took it. And that's another thing about your career. When you have opportunities, don't be afraid to jump on them and take them. Being too risk averse is not a good thing. It's good to take an occasional risk. So I gave up a phenomenal job to get another phenomenal job, but with less pay. I took about a 1/3 reduction in pay, but that's okay. It's more important to do what you enjoy and what you're happy about, even though I did love TRW, but I think being a professor was even more stimulating. So I took that job on. Again, loved it, enjoyed the research, enjoyed the students. The research was, in fact, tied to a lot of what I was doing at TRW. I was working on military broadband communication systems, so I was taking a lot of those ideas and trying to figure out how to put them in semiconductor chips and reduce the size, power, cost, so that they could be useful for commercial applications. So that was our research program. Loved it, had a phenomenal time. I thought I could be a professor for the rest of my life, just like previously I thought I'd be an engineer the rest of my life at TRW. So again, opportunistically, the research we were doing was so relevant and important at the time. We were publishing papers on these broadband semiconductor chips that we had built as prototypes that nobody in the world had seen anything like that before. And a lot of companies out there got excited and said, hey, we could use that technology to convert our existing networks to be broadband capable. For example, the cable TV companies that were sending television signals over analog signals to the home figured out they could upgrade their networks and make them two-way digital networks using some of our technology. So they eventually convinced us to spin out, me and one of my graduate students, to start a company and start commercializing some of that technology. So again, it was an opportunistic thing that fell in our lap, and we jumped on it. Again, not being risk averse, we said, let's go do it. And we started the company, and that's how Broadcom got created. So it wasn't a grand plan of wanting to be an entrepreneur. In fact, I never took a single entrepreneurship class. I never took a single business class when I was in college. I took only engineering classes because I loved engineering so much. So I wasn't preparing myself to be an entrepreneur. It just kind of fell in my lap, and I dealt with it. And the rest is history. It turned out incredible. But it's about doing what you love doing and taking advantage of opportunities as they present themselves. And talking to people, understanding the world around you, where the needs are, and trying to focus your work on where you see the needs of society growing. And certainly broadband communications 25 years ago was a huge field of need because we were all stuck with these low bandwidth connections everywhere. So I knew what we were doing was important. I didn't know exactly how it would end up, but I knew it was important, and that's what drove me.
That's amazing. What an amazing story. And I'm excited to hear that you didn't have to have a business background to do that as well. So I'm I'm sure my graduate students are going to beat down my door and say, now it's time to take the plunge. So thank you for motivating us on that one. Now, the next one, you talked about, not being risk adverse and taking chances. So can you talk about any times that you've made mistakes or had any failures or unanticipated challenges you encountered along the way to building your career and that you wish you had known about before you became an entrepreneur?
Sure. Well, I was blessed. I was very fortunate that all the steps that I did take to advance my career ended up working out. I never had any failure where I had to restart and do something else. But that is pretty unusual, and I would say I count my blessings that I was able to do that. However, I was not risk averse. I was willing to take risks, which means I was willing to fail. Because I was lucky and I didn't, but that doesn't mean I wasn't prepared for it. So I think that's the most important thing is take the risk, be prepared to fail, and if you do, it's okay. I mean, you got to realize that with startups, 9 out of 10 fail. And in Broadcom's case, in terms of being ultra successful, that may be 1 out of 1,000 that gets to the super successful rate. So you can expect that, but based on the odds, it's not likely to happen, but you will learn. And that's the most important thing. Continue to learn, to advance your knowledge, not only on the technology side, but if you start a company, you start getting involved on the business side. And those are all great learning experiences. And don't worry, if it doesn't work, start something else and do something else. But take advantage of opportunities as they present themselves. And if they fall in your lap, don't let them pass by. Somebody else will grab it and run with it.
I like the fact that you hit the nail on the head with HKN because we're always committed to always learning. We're not done just because we graduate. So I think that's an amazing career. So the last question we have for you is, we know you're into sports, so we want to hear about what do you think esports is heading, or where do you think esports is heading, and how can I break in, not me personally, but the student, how can I break into this industry, and what is your opinion on owning an esports team since you have experience in owning a hockey team? So what do you think?
No, it's a great question. Esports is an interesting phenomenon. I mean, it is exploding in popularity. And actually, we've decided to get involved in esports, not from a business perspective, but from our foundation. We recognized very early on, many years ago, that because kids are getting so involved in esports, we thought, is there a way we can leverage that and try to kind of rope them in or trick them into becoming more STEM literate as part of their esports program? So we got in touch with UCI, which has one of the leading esports programs in the country, and talked to the professors there about, could we structure something with middle school, high school, and starting with high school esports, and get these kids a broader perspective rather than just focus on the game? Can they focus more on other STEM-related activities that are related to this and essentially become a more STEM-literate individual, even though they're playing the esports? And we did. We came up with an incredible program and started what we call the North American Scholastic Esports Federation, NASEF, which is ongoing today and is very popular. And what it does is it builds esports teams, not just of players, but if you look at a sports franchise, there are 10 times more people not doing the sports than doing the sports. So God, I should have brought myself a glass of water. I didn't. Apologize for hoarseness. So we, you look at marketing and sales and television and radio, the internet, websites you have to create. There's so many things around sports, trainers, coaches. So we brought them all together and created this whole curriculum around esports. That's become incredibly popular and the students love it. So that's how we focused in on it through philanthropy and through getting high school kids broader interests. However, from a professional side, we're approached all the time about potentially investing or buying esports teams. And personally, I have not dived into that because I haven't yet seen a business model. I think the popularity is there. There's no question esports is incredibly popular, but how can you make money as owning an esports team has yet to be determined, because one of the critical things with any business is to be more successful, you want to create a competitive advantage around you and become one of only a few competitors in any market. If you look at the most successful companies out there, Google and Amazon and Facebook, they're pretty much the dominant market player, and that's why they're so successful. They have very little competition. For in esports, there are so many other esports games out there, and anybody can create an esports team. So it's hard to see where you can create these competitive advantages. Like a traditional sports team, once the leagues mature, they limit the number of teams. In baseball, hockey, football, basketball, you have 30 teams or 32 teams in a league, and that's it. So you have a limited number. Esports hasn't achieved that maturity level yet, where you have a limited number of teams and a limited number of leagues to prevent unlimited competition, because with unlimited competition, it's hard to come up with a viable business model. So I think it will mature over time, but it's going to take more time. So I personally have not jumped in, and I don't feel comfortable yet. I think it's hard enough managing a hockey team to be profitable, and the Ducks have not been profitable. Usually, sports teams take a long time to become profitable because you have very high-paid athletes. So I would say esports is something I'll stay away from a business investment perspective for a while, but we will very much be involved with it on the philanthropic side, getting the kids more excited about it.
What a brilliant strategy for engaging, meeting kids where they are and love with the things they love. So that's a wonderful thing. Thank you so much for all you do. So Henry, on behalf of HKN and all of our graduating students, I want to thank you so much for being with us here today and for being the epitome of our HKN Eminent members, so that we can show other students and professionals this is what we should all be aspiring to do. So thank you again for your time, and have a wonderful weekend at your esports event.
Well, thank you so much. And again, congratulations to all your HKN graduates, and good luck to all of you in your future endeavors.